want to just sort of reflect a little bit on the kind of the media message about the current state of the teacher labor market. And as someone who has been following the teacher labor markets for about 25 years, I have seen these cycles where we see lots of high-profile stories about the teacher shortage or the mass teacher exodus. And I won't read this quote, but what's really struck me about some stories that have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN recently, is that they suggest that there is in fact a mass exodus of teachers treated generically. I want to emphasize this point of the treatment of the teacher role as generic. And they treat the exodus as if it's solely related to the preferences of the individual teachers or teacher candidates. And on its head, because I think that we need to be paying much more attention to the demand side of the market and sending some of the right signals to the labor market. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. So just a few stylized facts about teachers and the teacher labor market. You know, there's all this rhetoric that teachers matter. And I think that when the rhetoric gets so embedded in conversations, it's easy to ignore it, but I don't think that anyone should ignore it. I mean, the differences that we see in the effectiveness of teachers, their lives, test scores, other kinds of K-12 outcomes, and as work by Raj Chetty and colleagues have shown, adult outcomes. And I'm just a little bit worried that the teachers matter mantra is, again, it's so prevalent that, you know, you just sort of push it aside. As Johnny mentioned at the introduction, there's inequity in the distribution of teachers across students, and we could maybe talk a little bit more about why that is, but the inequity does matter for student achievement and for closing achievement gaps. Teacher labor markets are super local, and that has implications, I think, for how we might think about student teaching as a leverage point to change the teacher labor market. And it's a challenge, but I think it's an opportunity coming out of the pandemic to rethink some of the localness of the teacher labor market. So again, I'll try and come back to that point too. I think there's some low-hanging fruit in terms of student teaching and clinical experiences and ways that it could be improved to both address some of the areas where there are teacher shortages and also basically develop the capacities of teachers to be ready on day one when they show up and inherit a classroom. And then lastly, I mentioned I'm getting old. Implicitly, I mentioned that. I've been following, you know, the teacher labor market for a while now, and you do see this sort of recurring pattern of stories where people focus on the challenges, the shortages, and it doesn't seem like we do a great job as policymakers and practitioners in addressing those challenges. We just see sort of the same patterns come up again and again. All right. So here's some perspective on the teacher labor market from the best kind of national data that exists. And the blue bars are the number of people who are the number of individuals that are getting a teaching credential every year. And the gray bars are the people who are really new to the teaching profession, novices, total novices, no existing teaching experience. And what you see from this picture, I hope, is that every year there are tens to hundreds of thousands more people who get a teaching credential than will get employed. So I think the idea, as some of the media kind of portrays it, that there's a national teacher shortage is just kind of wrong-headed. There is no national teacher labor market, for one thing. You know, it's a state by state because of state licensure systems, but also there's not a shortage if you treat teachers generically and just look at the number of bodies that are out there, people who are getting endorsements. This is a picture of Washington State over about 35 years, and what different kinds of teacher attrition looks like. So blue are people who left the workforce altogether, and you can see that, that's roughly 6 to 8% of teachers leave the workforce entirely on average every year. And then the green stack bar is people who leave and stay in public schools, but not in a teaching role. And then the red are people who are moving from one school to another. And I throw this up here to make 2 points. One is that the teacher labor market is relatively stable. That's all right, Megs. We're not. We'll skip the time. Someone will have to give me a signal. Let me try it one more time to get the timer back. If I'm going over, someone give me okay. Teacher labor market is relatively stable in terms of the number of people who leave the profession. It varies, again, by a percentage point or two over time. And the bottom panel is the unemployment rate in Washington. And so there's this inverse relationship, right? So when unemployment gets low, teacher attrition tends to go up and vice versa. And hence you see these stories that tend to occur when the general labor market is quite tight. But the fact that if you've read between the lines, or maybe not so much between the lines, I've said that there is no national teacher labor market, there is no national teacher shortage, does not mean that there aren't some real pinch points in the teacher labor market, some areas where it is really, really challenging to recruit and retain people, staff classrooms, year over year. And the point I want to make here is I want to focus in on 2 periods. 1999-2000 is when there was the dot-com bubble. The different color bars are the different areas of teacher endorsement or credentials, specialization. Yellow are people who are getting endorsed to teach at the elementary level. And I'm going to contrast that with red. I can't quite see that because of the picture, STEM, and blue is ELL. Blue is special education, and orange is English language learners. So in 1999 was one of these periods where people were talking about the teacher shortage, and I want to contrast that with 2011-12. Right? When most people were not talking about the teacher shortage. This is when we're coming out of the Great Recession, and school budgets are still pretty tight. And the point I want to make here is that in 1999, at the elementary ed level, it was not fewer people reported challenges in terms of vacancies. At the elementary level, when everybody's talking about the teacher shortage, then people reported challenges in these high demand fields when nobody was talking about the teacher shortage, and you didn't see, front page articles in the New York Times. So that's just to emphasize this issue of that there are still pinch points even when we're not talking about it. All right, here is my best take on what does the teacher labor market look like right now. In Washington State, we scraped the website to get information about job postings. And we looked at job postings, by different categories, and we normalized it by the FTE from a couple of years earlier in those categories to create these vacancy rates. And, the point here again is it's the sort of the same old. It's really challenging to hire people in English language learners, special educators, compared to elementary education. Those are the clear bars are for all districts across the state. And it's also much more challenging for high poverty districts, which are the darkest bars are low poverty districts. The mid dark bars are the high poverty districts. So it's just across the board more challenging for high poverty districts than low poverty districts. And again, this is a pattern that is consistent over time. When we take a quick look at urbanicity, there's also this pattern that is kind of tends to be emerging in relatively new research, which is that rural school systems have a slightly harder time staffing certain kinds of classrooms. So I think that we need to pay attention to the rurality of school systems. I'm going to come back to this point when I start talking about student teaching. All right. I can tell that I'm not going as fast as I need to, so I'm going to actually skip this. The patterns today echo the patterns that we see over the last 25 or 30 years. So again, emphasizing the point, there are these pinch points in the teacher labor market. Areas of teacher specialization, special ed, STEM, ELL. Challenges, shortages in challenging schools. These are usually high poverty schools, schools populated by students of color, schools with low achieving students. And then there are geographic challenges. And I think that there's a real nexus between teacher preparation, schools districts, and student teaching that both plays a role in sending signals to prospective teachers, and where there's some low-hanging fruit in terms of the development of teacher candidates so that they are more ready on day one. So I'm going to talk about both of those things. This is a picture of Washington State. This is just a reminder to me to say that we are working with a series of teacher education programs in Washington State, which we're going to refer to as the TELC programs, the Teacher Education Learning Collaborative. But the TELC programs are not equally representative of all of the districts in the state. They serve about 90%, they develop about 90% of the new teachers west of the Cascade Mountains. So a lot of the research I'm going to talk about is based on this area of the state so that it's more representative. All right. Again, Washington State. And what I've done here is, I said but this is a collection of researchers. What we have done here is we have juxtaposed for every school district the percentage of teachers in the district that are hosting student teachers, and that is the color. Darker blue is a higher percentage, up to 15% of classrooms, and dark red is you're not hosting any student teachers. And we've juxtaposed that against a measure of the staffing challenge in the district, which is the percentage of teachers that are new teachers that are on emergency credentials. That's the size of the bubble. And if you stare at this picture, a couple things jump out. One, the bubbles that are bluer, and you have to know a little bit about the labor market in Washington, but they're bluer right around teacher education programs. Because, not surprisingly, and for some good reasons, student teaching tends to happen geographically proximate to teacher education programs. But the other thing to note is that there are a lot of big red bubbles. So places that are not hosting many student teachers, and in a lot of cases none, are the same places that are likely to suffer challenges with teacher hiring. Now, this is me speculating. We don't know, we don't have any empirical evidence about what I'm about to say. But I would speculate that there are at least some portion of student teachers that would be willing to consider teaching in a district that tends to be rural and farther away from teacher education programs if they got familiar with that community. And one good way to get familiar with the community is doing student teaching in that community. Right now, I think that these districts tend to have relatively few people at the front end of the pipeline. They tend to get few applicants. We don't really know all that well because there's not great statewide application data in Washington, but anecdotally, that's the case. All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about sort of the churn that we see in the early career of teacher candidates. So working with these TELC programs, we are able to follow the people who are doing the student teaching and see where do they end up. Do they end up as K-12 classroom teachers, which is this pink area in year 1, year 2, and year 3? Do they end up employed elsewhere by public K-12 public systems, which is the kind of teal and blue and green? Do they end up employed in elsewhere in the Washington economy, which is this beige color, or do they not show up in the unemployment data set? And I want to point out 2 things about this. We see a lot of people that are moving from what we call teaching adjacent positions, right in here, especially public K-12 other, into teaching from year 1 to year 2. So that's the width of these streams. So this teal stream that I'm highlighting. And to a lesser extent from year 2 to year 3. The width of these streams into teaching is larger than the exodus of people out of the teaching profession. And this panel that I've got up here, these are STEM education candidates. Again, we follow the student teachers for the first 3 years of their post-student teaching careers. We actually do this for 10 years, but I can't put up the 10-year figure. It's a mess. About 55% of them over 10 cohorts. So this is early cohorts and cohorts during the Great Recession when employment probabilities were much lower than they are now. But about 55% of them show up getting a K-12 public education teaching job in year 1. After a couple of years, it's closer to 70%. This is the figure for elementary ed endorsed teachers. Right? So you see the same churning, but the probability of employment is a lot lower in any year. I think, and again, it's a little bit of speculation, but I'll tell you why in a second I believe it's the case, that a lot of the people that are moving from this green category into the pink category, they are doing a lot of substitute teaching in school districts that are considered choice school districts to work in. Until a teaching position opens up and they have made themselves familiar with the district and the district's familiar with them, and the probability they get hired is enhanced. All right, now I want to say, why do I think that those are people that are kind of just hanging out in school districts waiting for a slot to open? And again, this is the demand side of the market, not the supply side, right? I'm suggesting that there are a lot of people that want to teach, but there aren't the slots for them. Because we looked at the transition of wages and earnings, I'm going to put up the wages, of people who move in and out of teaching. So the way this chart works, and this is actually the first time I'm debuting this chart, so hopefully it's going to work out, is that if you move into teaching, we difference your wages or earnings from 1 year to the next, your pre-teaching earnings and your teaching earnings. And we look at the distribution of earnings for those that make that transition into teaching. So the average earnings of people who transition into teaching, they're earning about $9 more per hour, right? So those folks that we didn't observe as teachers initially, when they become teachers, on average, they get a bump in salary. We also look at the people, thanks, Max. We also look at the people who move out, and they tend to have a decrease in salary. So it looks like from this group of people that are fully credentialed to teach, that teaching looks like a pretty good, it looks like a pretty good occupation in terms of the financial returns. I want to be really clear that this is not a comparison of all people who graduate with a BA or an MA and how the earnings compare. These are just folks who have demonstrated through going through teacher education program and doing everything they need to be credentialed that they really want to teach. I think it's a different question about whether teaching salaries are generally competitive enough. It's a different issue. All right, I'm getting low on time, so I'm going to talk even a little bit faster. Student teaching. Student teaching tends to occur in relatively more advantaged classrooms than the classroom where you end up as a first-year teacher. So we can look at that differential between the demographics of where you did your student teaching, the poverty level, the achievement level, the percentage of students of color, which is on the x-axis, and the first-year teaching classroom, which is on the y-axis, and see the degree to which that combination of classroom experiences predicts things like your attrition rate. That's the picture that I've got up here. And I won't go into too much detail, but the bottom line is, if your student teaching classroom more closely mirrors your first-year classroom, you are less likely to leave the profession. It is also true, by the way, that you report being more prepared and that you are more effective in value-added terms, in terms of the growth you contribute to student test scores. Another thing that I think is quite important is who is assigned as the mentor teacher. So the way this chart works is we're going to look at teacher effectiveness in their first 5 years in the profession, right? Teachers get more effective as they gain early career teaching experience, okay? So that's the upward slope here. These are folks that are assigned to pretty ineffective teachers that serve as a mentor teacher. This is the equivalent for teachers that are served, who do their student teaching with a teacher who is of average effectiveness. And this is the figure if you do your student teaching with a highly effective teacher as your mentor. Now, it just so happens that if you do your student teaching with a mentor who is highly effective, you look more like a teacher who has 2 years of teaching experience under her belt. Now, I like this because we know how much more people get paid when they have 2 years of teaching experience, and it's thousands of dollars, right? I can't remember what exactly it is in Washington, $3,000, $4,000. But the folks that serve as mentor or cooperating teachers, what we call them in Washington State, they typically do not get anywhere near that much when they serve in that role. So hopefully the message is student teaching can be a lever for changing shortage issues, addressing shortage issues, development of teacher candidates in terms of the alignment of student teaching experiences and first-year experiences, and thinking more critically about who serves as the mentor teacher. That is, if there's capacity to change the allotment of student teaching assignments, right? If everybody's used up, right? If all of if everybody who could serve as a mentor is serving as a mentor, then there's not much scope for change. But it turns out there's a lot of scope for change. If I was there in person, I would pick on someone in the audience and say, what percentage of teachers serve as mentor teachers in a year? Since we're not in person, I'll just tell you it's about 3% in Washington and nationally. So there's, like I said, a lot of scope for change. And so the way that we look at this is we say, okay, where are the mentor teachers, and who are the potential mentor teachers? Thank you. Okay, so where are the mentor teachers? Most of them are really close to the teacher education program, same district, within 25 miles, within 50 miles. Lots of folks could serve as mentor teachers, but are not. Okay, then we look at the people who are more effective that are not serving as mentors. This is going back to that prior slide that's showing that it really matters if you have someone who's effective serving as a mentor, right? And the bottom line is you could really reallocate. This is a picture that I don't have time to talk through, but you could reallocate the folks serving with teachers pretty ineffective based on their value added, and move them all into being all the student teachers into classrooms that they're working with very effective mentor teachers. There's definitely scope for change. as a labor economist, it makes sense to me to use salaries as a policy lever, and we typically don't in education, to send signals to prospective teachers. But I also think that there is a role for either the state and or school systems to send similar labor market cues about the potential that you're going to end up in a teaching position. This harkens back to the fact that many of the people who are training to teach, and again, they've gone all the way through the process, it really looks like they want to teach. And a lot of them are getting hang out in districts in low paid positions until a job opens up. We could send signals to them that suggest that, hey, if you get trained to be a STEM teacher, an ELL teacher, a special education teacher, your job prospects are a lot better. So I'll stop there, turn it back to Johanna, I think, and look forward to discussion.
Yes, thank you, Dan. So we have a couple really good questions, some from Ed Crow. Folks who know Ed Crow are not surprised that he's sending very thoughtful questions in. So I'm trying to pick one of my favorites. I think I'm actually going to pick up on an observation that he made around community colleges, because this is something that's relatively new in the North Carolina context, a 2+2 articulation agreement, and we have a fabulous community college system that's working really well with the public system and private independent system as well, in providing more regional options for pathways into teaching. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about, with the regional nature of seeing the clusters around student teaching and the likelihood of folks getting hired into those spots. How do you see, what advice would you give? Do you see this as a promising move for North Carolina to put more attention into this 2+2 pathway with community colleges?
My first part of my answer is a caveat, which is that this gets into the realm of this is the part of the agenda that's speculation and Dan's opinion, as opposed to empirical grounded work. I do think it's promising. I think it's promising because, again, of the localness of teacher labor markets. I should have also mentioned that 40% of, at least in Washington, 40% of the teachers that are hired into a school district did their student teaching in a lot of districts in those very same districts. So this is just to emphasize this local issue. But I would offer up a caution. And the caution is that I don't think we do enough to think about differences in the institutions, just like we don't do enough to think about the differences in individual teachers. So a well-known now finding is that master's degrees in general are not particularly predictive of teacher effectiveness. And a speculation as to why is because we tend to grant the master's pay premium regardless of the area of the master's degree and the quality of the institution, conferring the master's degree. So I think that it's promising to think about community colleges playing a role, but I also think that we need to do more to connect pre-service to in-service and learn what constitutes effective pre-service preparation, and not think about the community college role as potentially generic, because I think there's a lot to be learned from heterogeneity within this variation within the system. So Ed, I hope I got it's nice to see Ed, and I hope I got to the answer eventually.
No, you've given us some helpful nuance to think about that opportunity here in North Carolina. Another question relates to what we can learn from the medical residency placement process that isn't necessarily tied to the hospital having a relationship with the medical school, but really looking at the market. Can you, again, speculate? Is there anything to be learned there around the data and the algorithm that they use? There's
I think, less evidence than people might guess. This is not my area of expertise for sure, but from what I understand, there's less evidence than people might guess about the sort of the medical residency and how the different ingredients that go into it contribute to having effective doctors. But I think sometimes I have seen the medical analogy oversold. So the pipeline of people who want to become doctors is narrowed a great deal earlier than we narrow the teacher pipeline, and doctors earn a whole lot more than teachers do, and so there's a real demand to become a doctor that maybe we don't see in teaching, which is one of the reasons why I tried to throw out that caution about interpreting the teacher salary issue, because I personally think that it would be good if teacher salaries were higher, and that drew more people into wanting to be in the profession, and that we could be more selective about who was actually granted entree into the profession. But that's a very different kind of model.
Okay, well, more to come, and Dan's going to join at the end of the North Carolina panel. We're going to bring him back on after he's heard some of our North Carolina experts talk. So thank you, Dan, so much. I think you've stirred up quite a bit of intrigue today. You're pushing our thinking. So now we're going to hear from some valued North Carolina educators and leaders on what they think about the insights presented in the data and what resonates here in our state. There is no better person to lead this discussion than one of my favorite people, who also happens to be a Belk Foundation board member, Dr. Alison Welcher. Alison has been involved in the Belk Foundation since her days as a school principal, when she first served on our grants committee. After receiving her doctorate at Harvard, she now serves in senior leadership with public impact, overseeing the opportunity culture work that she first piloted in her own school at Ransom IB Middle School. Alison will be joined by three important people to the Belk Foundation: Dr. Paul Fitchett, who has been instrumental in redesigning the teacher preparation and clinical experiences at the Cato College of Education at UNC Charlotte; Dr. Monique Perry-Graves, who leads one of our stalwart partners, Teach for America North Carolina; and Meaghan Harris, an exemplary multi-classroom leader at Governor's Village STEM Academy, a school led by Alejandra Garcia, a current Belk Foundation's Grants Committee member, who is, I know, cheering Meaghan on right there on Zoom. So Alison, because we're high tech here, I'm going to tilt my owl video across the room to you as you begin to speak.
Excellent, great. Well, thank you, Johanna, for that excellent introduction. Thank you again, State Superintendent Truitt, and thank you, Dan, for that great information that you shared. I'm excited to lead and moderate this panel today, and to really take our focus in now on North Carolina, specifically to understand how these trends are affecting the educational experience of students right here in our state. We heard State Superintendent Truitt speak about the teacher pipeline and the multiple opportunities, the 2+2 programs, the teacher cadet programs that are happening. And Dan really gave us a really great insight around this issue of supply and demand. And so as I jump right here into the panel, I want to kind of organize our thinking around these three buckets of recruitment, training, and retaining. And so as we know, in order for there to be an ongoing supply of highly effective teachers for our students, we must address the pipeline, right, first and foremost. So I want to start with Dr. Monique Perry-Graves, who leads the TFA work here in North Carolina, and really want to help understand how you're thinking about building that teacher pipeline and how TFA goes about that, but what are some other unique ways that you're thinking about how that goes?
Thank you, Alison, and thank you to Johanna and the Belk team for having me here at this panel. What we are seeing from a pipeline perspective, I do want to underscore some of the themes that were shared by Superintendent Truitt and by Dan. I do think there's multiple on-ramps and multiple pathways. Teach for America is one. We've been in the state for 30 years. Lots of evidence of that impact, but there are many on-ramps and pathways. I also want to underscore, and I'd be remiss as coming from the community college space into Teach for America, to double down on the fact that we are extremely fortunate in the state of North Carolina to have a premier community college system that's consistently recognized on a national level, in addition to our four-year system. And we really, really need to consider that and be mindful of that. One of the things that Teach for America is known for, and kind of our cornerstone, is really what I would say the discovery and attraction of leaders to the profession. So one of the things that stuck out to me from our conversation with Dan is around the narrative. Versus the data, and that in today's world, we do have to attract people to the field because this is talent that we're contending with. And so we have a longstanding model of attracting leaders to the field that ultimately stay in classrooms across the state. But one of the things that we're looking for is how we can also diversify what that model looks like. So we have some longstanding success in North Carolina. Right now, we have about 225 plus first and second year teachers currently teaching, but we also are looking at how we can attract people back to the state. So if they're in other professions outside of North Carolina, have roots in North Carolina, how can we bring them back? They are already certified, they already have some experience, and attract them back to the profession. I know many of us on this call may have second and third careers. I think we should uplift the teaching profession in that regard. Now, there's some other factors surrounding education that Dan spoke to that would influence that, pay being one. But as we look at even our first and second year teachers and some of the retention themes, I know we'll get into that later, a lot of the factors we're seeing are in the schoolhouse, but some of them are outside of the schoolhouse as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for kicking us off. Now, Dr. Paul Fitchett, I know that you've done some great work around redesigning that teacher preparation program opportunity at the Cato College at UNC Charlotte. Tell me about some of these shifts that you've made and how that's creating a stronger experience for candidates who are going into teaching.
Well, first I wanted just to acknowledge that while I did lead the work, it was a collaboration amongst the faculty and staff at the Cato College of Education and our local school partners. And one of the things that really came out of what Dan spoke of that resonates with me as somebody who works within an EP, a traditional EPP, is the idea, the notion of these localized markets, and the idea that it's important for us as an EPP to be good faith partners with those local markets, i.e. school districts. So some of the things we've done at the Cato College of Education and have been funded by the Belk Foundation have included the Teacher Education Institute, where we've brought together practicing teachers, future clinical educators, or the parlance is usually cooperating teachers, along with our faculty to talk about what we view to be core practices around and what do we value. What this has done is it has allowed us to, in some ways, have a shared vision for what we agree to be really good teaching in terms of our practice. And it also has allowed us to make sure that when we get to that student teaching piece that Dan refers to as a low-hanging fruit, that our candidates are well prepared for that internship experience. In addition to that notion of providing that equitable experience across the district, one of the other things at the Cato College of Education we are serious about is promoting teachers of color and making sure that we have teachers of color. The data, and I'm sure Dan can speak to this as well, indicates that in North Carolina, as in most of the country, the teachers of color are underrepresented in school districts in which there are majority students of color. And so the things that we're doing in the Cato College of Education include upping our recruitment efforts and placing our pre-service teachers with cooperating teachers of color to help create a network so that these teachers have support structures in place. And I want to give a shout out to my colleague who I know is on this call, Dr. Tisha Green, who's leading a lot of that work. So I think in general, what's really important for us as an EPP is to make sure, going back to Dan's talk around recognizing that policy implementation can't just be a broad brush approach. There has to be nuance involved in it, and the local EPPs should have some autonomy to work with their school districts to make sure that they provide educational, equitable outcomes for the students in the area.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul. Now, Dan also mentioned this idea of a mirror experience, which I'm going to kind of say is more like where our teachers are getting trained and the opportunity to experience teaching for the first time. If they have that same experience during their first years of teaching, they'll likely be more successful, and their perception of their success is probably going to be stronger. Talk about a little bit, Monique and/or Paul, what data are you all seeing, or what data would you like to have to suggest that that is the case, and what can we be doing more of to make sure that that is the case, that that mirror experience exists, so that we can start seeing teachers, the demand matching, the supply matching the demand?
I can jump in and then I'll turn to my colleague, Paul. I think longitudinal data I would love to see. So the researcher in me, and I think Dan Caprice, would like to see a longitudinal study connecting all of those dots related to that localized market and what those factors mean. But one of the things that we see and that a lot of folks in this call have supported is bringing that training, matching that with the proximity of the district and bringing that back. And so one of the things that we've had to suspend due to COVID, but we're excited to bring back, is that experience and that localized experience in proximity to the district and in proximity to the communities that are being served. And so I think that's a really big factor that comes into play with that, and also anchoring teachers in a way that Dan spoke to about that mirror at the beginning and that initial start.
I think Monique makes some excellent points. This kind of gets to your question, but I think rubs against it a little bit, is that one of the things that we have found in our local partners is that in the schools that are often those that are underserved or are lower performing, to use that terminology, unfortunately, we often don't necessarily always have teachers who have as much experience or kind of fall within those kind of quality indicators of what's known as quote unquote effective teaching. So one of the things that that we think is a promising practice in EPPs is partnering maybe not just one student teacher with a strong teacher, but maybe two, right? So the idea of having two novice teachers or student teachers with a very experienced teacher to perhaps offset some of those issues. And those are that's an area that we're also exploring at the Cato College of Education. But I think in addition to those things, I think it's really important that that we also get some of the feedback from the candidates themselves about their experiences. I think it's great to look at some of these data around the effectiveness metrics, but to know, to find out if if the mentor teachers we're using are actually good mentors is important. I mean, indicators related to EVOS scores or the North Carolina evaluation system tell us about their teaching ability, but they don't really tell us about their ability to be mentors. And so some sort of metric around those things would also be very helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Paul, thank you so much for that great pivot. And for the audience out there, as we talk about mentor teachers, this may be known, but I always like to make sure we're on the same page, common language: mentor teacher, cooperating teacher, clinical educator, but also want to bring in like this idea of effective educator. We've got Meaghan Harris here on the line also with us, who is an opportunity culture multi-classroom leader. And I'd love just to hear from you, Meaghan. First, gratitude and grace. She has been in the schoolhouse today teaching our students. So thank you, Meaghan, for being with us. But I would love for you to talk with us just a little bit about what kinds of things are you seeing when you are supporting novice teachers. Tell us a little bit about what your role entails as an effective educator. What does that look like for you?
Thank you. I think one of the biggest things that's really important, and one thing that I noticed within my role, is to be able to support teachers holistically. Really, when you think about it, the content piece for a lot of teachers comes naturally, and I think that's just with how technology has evolved over years. But the relationship piece is one of the biggest areas that I'm noticing that our teachers that are new to the profession need a lot of support with. We're very much a customer service business. Our students are our clients, our parents, the community are our clients. So what we're doing is we're trying to build relationships in order to then be able to effectively teach them. So that's one big area that I find I spend a lot of my time with students, is just working to build relationships. And then, of course, because of COVID, we're seeing more challenges in the schoolhouse with just the social and emotional aspect.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meaghan. And I'm going to stick with you for a bit because I think this helps to get to a bit of this question around retention, not only for our novice and beginning teachers, but for you as an effective teacher. So I first want to start with you. You have been a multi-classroom leader for 8 years, many years, right? Did I get that number right?
This is my 4th year as a multi-classroom leader. Prior to that, I was an academic facilitator, served as the interim assistant principal a year, and then I was a classroom teacher for 5 years.
Excellent. Thank you so much for correcting me on that. And so talk about the impact of you having the opportunity to be a teacher leader, being an effective teacher, to want to stay, right? And to help train, by the way, other science and math teachers, which we know is a shortage. What has been the impact for you and the benefit for you?
I definitely think having the experience makes it very real and valuable. You know, we step out of classroom roles sometimes, and I think it's always refreshing to, you know, have that ability to step back in periodically, whether it's covering a class because of, you know, staffing shortages for the day. One thing for me is that it just makes it very real to me. I think that's also something that brings value to the teachers I support. I'm very much a practice what I preach. So if there's something I'm expecting of you, it's either something I've done or something I'm willing to do. Of course, I started teaching in 2008, so technology has evolved. I had an overhead projector in my classroom my first year teaching. So my newer teachers are showing me now how to operate Promethean boards, whereas I didn't have that as a classroom teacher. So I think there are a lot of ways and things that I learned, and I think that's the piece that sticks with me, is that you have to be open and willing to learn, and you never stop learning. And even though I work with a lot of beginning teachers, they're teaching me a lot of things that, you know, I might need support with as far as technology, or sometimes different strategies that maybe I'm not accustomed to or familiar with, but still can get to our kids effectively.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I noticed in our conversation, we had one question about residencies, but that is not something that we on this call necessarily represent. And so I want to pull residencies into the conversation and talk a little bit about what possibilities are there and the benefits of a residency model. Anyone for that question, what do you think could be the possibilities of having residencies as an option for folks who want to enter into the teaching profession? What types of unique opportunities does that provide that we're not currently seeing in North Carolina?
Well, I'll start with this one, and then I'd love to hear what Meaghan's thinking about, as well as Monique. I think the residency model, well, it's interesting because we use the word residency in North Carolina parlance different than they do at the national level, right? Yes. So residency teachers in North Carolina are very similar to, and this is for Dan's edification, more for probably the rest of the group, where residency in North Carolina really refers to essentially lateral entry teachers. You know? But I think you're referring to the kind of model of residence, like the Boston teacher residency models. You know, I think that speaks directly to what the three of us are talking about, right? I think it speaks to the opportunities for leadership that Meaghan was talking about. I also think it provides opportunities for various access points like Monique was talking about. And I think from our standpoint, from an EPP lens, it's that notion of localization of the market, right? Where you can craft courses, you work hand in hand with classroom teachers, with faculty who do research on practices to help support novice teachers along the way. And at the same time, they're in the classroom. Right, so they're able to work in the classroom, maybe offset where there are those little buckets of shortages that we see in North Carolina, particularly in those areas that Dan was mentioning around special education, ELL, STEM, and world languages.
I'll jump in. I think it kind of underscores the importance of context mattering and proximity mattering. So again, the exponential increase we have in residency type programs in the North Carolina definition is important. I also think it can provide us an opportunity as we continue to talk about the representation and diverse educators in the classroom. And so one of the things, just kind of what's closer to me is our model, is that we do have those pathways with the core members we recruit, and we find that close to 50% of our core is individuals that are individuals of color. And so when we think about access, and I want to kind of raise that into the conversation, I think that's another pathway of access that can really speak to some of the other goals we have from education context.
Monique, thank you so much for raising that, right? Because in residencies, ideally, those individuals are getting paid, right, in doing the work. Everyone doesn't have the privilege of being a full-time student teaching, and trying to want to be a teacher, right? So the residency actually provides that, which we know is going to create more equitable access socioeconomically, but also racially. Excellent. Meaghan, anything to add just on the role in terms of having a resident, having someone by virtue as a resident who is there long-term really in the classroom versus a student teacher who may not be able to be there as much? What impact does that have on students and for that teacher in their learning?
I think it just brings to light, what the teaching profession truly involves. I'm a graduate of UNC Charlotte. I did my undergrad work there, student teaching here in CMS. So I remember that semester particularly, I did, pop-ins once a week for a semester, and then I did my semester-long internship. So there were pieces of the first semester of the school year that I missed that were heavy because I student taught in the spring. So I'm just thinking about the things that come along with the day-to-day of what a school year entails. A lot of the walkthroughs and data conversations, things that I may have missed along the way that I started to learn. Just thinking about how do we prepare a teacher for what the start to the end of the year might look like. And really what work is involved with it. I'm a firm believer in being very transparent. Teaching is a hard job. So we want to be able to set teachers up for success and understanding the commitment they are making, but then also within the school building, what levels of support are available. We have a beginning teacher support program. We have instructional coaches. We have instructional leaders through our admin. So just understanding the role of the many colleagues within the building and how they're there to be able to support you.
Absolutely. Excellent. Thanks so much for diving into that topic there. And I'm monitoring the chat as well. I've learned to multitask here on Zoom and seen a lot of comments around tutoring, right? So I want to bring that in, that residents also, not only as Meaghan stated, can have the experience of start to finish, but they can get really deep experience with students through small group tutoring, which we're seeing from research is going to have a huge impact, right? So not only are they learning and growing, but they are adding value add to the students in the building, which is what we are all here for. So we are nearing close to the end of our time. And so I want to ask just a closing question here. We want to really think about practice and policy. How do we move the bar? We know that there are opportunities for growth in this area of teacher shortages. And so would love for each of you to just think about what would we want to say to policymakers, right, on this front around ensuring that effective teachers are available for all students, right? Every child from rural North Carolina to our urban epicenters, Black, brown, white children, students who are affluent and students who are coming from low socioeconomic environments. What is it that we think most needs to be done?
I just want to say one thing, and then it's a great question. I think there's a lot of talk around access and education and improving the quantity of the pipeline. And I agree, that is something we need to be very thoughtful of. But there's also the issue of the quality of that programming. And I think it's very important from a policy standpoint that we're not only thinking about those outputs in terms of driving measures around education policy, but the inputs themselves as well, including what we know about what makes good policy around teacher preparation, including those experiences related to their student teaching experience, but as well making sure that candidates have a mixture of both subject matter and pedagogical content knowledge. Those are the things we know matter.
Thank you.
I think Paul summarized that really well. The only thing I would add to that is really continuing to amplify, and Meaghan spoke to this from the supports perspective. If we consider the context of our school districts across the state, all school districts do not have the ability to invest resources in those staff supports. And if so, in some cases, what we're seeing, those individuals are being dedicated to more crucial real-time issues due to staff shortages. So I just want to raise that issue along with pay. And in addition to the fact that we want teachers to be able to live in their communities where they work as well. And so I think things such as housing and some of the other social issues, not the context of this conversation, but I do want to definitely emphasize that is definitely a factor, especially with retention.
I think Monique and Paul said it beautifully. Again, I'll reiterate, teaching is a very hard job. I work with some fantastic educators who are dedicated day in and day out. I think to really sum it up, our kids deserve it. I'm a parent of a student in CMS, and I just think about what things I want for my son to be in place to help him to be successful. And so, you know, he's fortunate to have, you know, 5 wonderful teachers who support him every day. And just really thinking about how do we get our education system to a point where, you know, a parent can drop their child off at school and feel that comfort of making sure that they're in good hands and have been well trained and prepared, but also receive that consistent support as needed. So that's something I just think our kids deserve it. And that's something I would definitely want to advocate for.
Well, thank you all so much for that lively discussion. We do now want to take some questions from our audience. Johanna, am I taking them right here from the chat box?
Yeah, you
All
are.
right.
And we've also had Dan join.
All right. We've got Dan back with us. As we're queuing up our next question, again, if you have any questions, please get them into the chat and you can send them directly to the Belk Foundation. Dan, just any reactions to some of what the panelists shared?
I have a lot of reactions, more than I.
Reaction.
I'm gonna tick off a couple of them,
Okay.
and yeah, I'll tick off a couple and try not to be too long-winded. One is, I think that both what I presented and some of the discussion suggest that it would be a good thing if there are more differentiated roles in amongst public school teachers, and that one of those differentiated roles could be some kind of, mentor teacher. You're eligible to be a mentor teacher because you've met some thresholds of quality, and you could also imagine differentiated pay connected to those differentiated roles. So some ideas that probably resonate to the opportunity culture folks in the audience. I also think that in the discussion of residencies, and I understand it's a little different than like the Boston teacher residency, but I'm sort of taken by the UTeach program that folks may know about, but it started at UT Austin, and it's designed to get more STEM students into teaching, so there are more STEM teachers. And one of the things that I think is interesting about UTeach is that there are more early experiences that people get in classrooms that aren't necessarily the formalized student teaching sort of state stamp of approval, but it's a way that you can get people exposed to what it's like to be a teacher, not at the end of their academic career when they're a little bit locked in, at that point, but earlier on, and that there's some shuffling that happens so that hopefully you get a better match between the folks who end up as teachers and the desire to be a teacher. Sorry, the last thing, I'll just say one more thing I will say. I'm curious, and I'll ask this in the form of a question. What is the credential or credentials that are needed to be a substitute? So Louisiana sort of made it automatic that everybody who's a student teacher gets the credential to be a substitute teacher, and also gets additional compensation when they're doing their student teaching that the state is kicking in. But it's a nice way of perhaps helping school districts. One of the questions was about, like, why are we seeing so many places shut down if it's not about a mass exodus of teachers? I'm paraphrasing. And I think that it is about, COVID-related disruptions and people getting sick, and the fact that there maybe aren't enough subs in that kind of environment. So I wonder about how the credentialing works in North Carolina and whether that could help alleviate, both get people some more experiences and alleviate what we hope is sort of a short-term problem with keeping schools staffed.
I love the creative thinking there, Dan. Thank you so much for sharing that. Paul and Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts around measures of teacher effectiveness. Dan, as you spoke, you indicated, right, like this idea of mentor, there's not, really a firm, definition of who gets to become a mentor. Maybe it's some years of experience. And I know, Paul, in your work, as you help to identify clinical educators, there's some requirements, but what would we say about measures of teacher effectiveness? What are we seeing as, most important to help to identify that metric?
Paul, you first.
No, Dan, please. No, you. No, please. I insist.
I'm gonna back up and say, I think that when most people think about teacher evaluation and teacher evaluation in this country, they think it's a failure, and probably it's the last thing anybody wants to touch. I think that's a huge mistake, and I think it's a huge mistake for precisely this. Based on your question, but not just based on your question. There's so much about the role of being a teacher and who we might want in different kinds of roles, what we might learn in terms of pre-service teacher preparation and connecting that to teacher evaluations, and what are the needs of individual teachers so that they're not getting generic profession development, but they're getting profession development that's more tailored to what they, what are their areas of weakness, that all hinge on evaluations. So I say that, I say all that because one of the reasons that I think that we use value added, teachers' contribution to student learning on standardized tests, is because there's variation in the measure. So that if you say, well, we're going to use evaluations in lots of places, that means 90%, 95% of teachers are all in the same category. So you can't use it as sort of an instrument for any kind of policy. I happen to think that value added is a useful measure. I just don't think it's the be all end all. And I also think it's limited because it doesn't apply to all teachers. It's maybe 20, 25% of teachers. So I think that we need better evaluations, and connected to better evaluations could be, like who's eligible to serve as a mentor teacher in different kinds of career roles.
And Dan, while you're unmuted, student evaluations of teachers.
Yeah. The tripod, the student surveys, something of the Met study, just to get a little wonky, that was actually more closely correlated with teacher value added than were other measures. I'm a little bit worried about how we think about those findings generalizing, because if I'm a student, I have a seventh grader. She's terrific, but I think that she might not take the evaluations as seriously of her teachers if she's doing it every year for 5 or 7 teachers in middle school. And so I wonder about the extent to which we want to be that part of the process to be so embedded in larger systems.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that Dan went first. This is his expertise. I have more of a question for Dan. Does he feel that some of these observational tools, like the class instrument, could be used to determine the effectiveness of a teacher, because they've shown to be associated with other learning outcomes with students? Because I just wonder about those. They're clunkier and they're more cumbersome. But I just want to.
I don't know that the instruments are not my area of expertise for sure, but my kind of sense is that it's less about what kind of instrument you use class or TPEP if you're, you know, out in Washington, or I can't remember what some of the Charlotte Danielson. So it's less about the instrument than the culture of kind of rigor and feedback. So I think that we know from studies where there are different instruments used, that when there is good evaluation and feedback, it can matter. And it can matter for the growth of teachers. So it's not merely like a gotcha, you know, you get a bad evaluation, you're out. But it is, again, part of a broader system that is designed to help teachers get better. And yeah, probably for some teachers say this is maybe not the right profession for you. And so I think that it's more about the culture than the specific instrument. But yes, I do think that those kinds of instruments could be used.
And so, again, monitoring the chat, want to keep the conversation going where the people want the conversation to go, and love to bring Meaghan and Monique into the conversation if you have thoughts about this. So, you know, how do we separate the relative weak signal of performance improvement from the overwhelming signal of continued employment on teacher evaluations, right? Like, how can it be used just more effectively? Any reactions to that? Meaghan, having, you know, being in the work, Monique, thoughts of what you see from educators you work with?
Meaghan, I'll defer to you.
That's a very heavy question. I'm thinking about, you know, the evaluation instrument it just makes me think of just like that standardized test, right? It's very general and specific. However, we have teachers sometimes who might not do very well in certain areas on it, but are considered highly effective and can move kids, or vice versa. So I think that it's just one of those tools that we look at similar to with students. It's a data point. It's a data point in that we want to see how effective is a teacher, how can they move students, what particular group of students are they most successful with moving, and then from there, how do we use that strength to support others in the building. Similarly, when I look at the evaluation instrument for the state of North Carolina, I'm thinking about, you know, standard 1, leadership, then looking at the content piece, how do they align? And now I'm thinking about, just from my role as an MCL, how do I create a culture within my PLC or my grade level to where, you know, at minimum, I'm creating a standard where my teachers are proficient, right? So some of those things are naturally created, whether it's having lesson plans, being a part of the, you know, PLC community, contributing. So I think there are a lot of connections to it. They're just very different. But really, when we think about it, you know, that effectiveness is very key. However, that's not the only indicator sometimes of effective teaching. So it's just kind of being able to pull apart the pieces. And then again, where, you know, one teacher might do really well in this area, how do we support another one in this area? So just collaborative work, I think, can help overall.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about Dan's comment of the EVOS data, student growth data not being the end all be all, right? How do we triangulate data points to really understand the effectiveness of a teacher, right? To see really that full picture and the growth and the development that needs to happen.
Alison, I'll add in to what Meaghan shared. She's most proximate, so I wanted to make sure her voice was centered on that question. I think part of it is what we do with the evaluation. It is a data point, but what are we doing with it over time? And so even the example she mentioned about leadership, I know we haven't touched on that a lot in this conversation, but it's been top of mind for me. How does that feed into identifying leaders like Meaghan and like others? Because we know the impact of leaders in a school, in a district, on retention, on recruitment, those kinds of things. And often times they can be used to identify and serve up an opportunity for us to evaluate who may be promising for other pathways as well. And then that does attribute to effectiveness.
Absolutely. To shift gears a little bit, a lot of chatter in the chat box around tutoring and the role of tutoring. We know that there has been lots of research that's been building around the effectiveness of tutoring. And we know in this, I won't say post-COVID, because we are definitely still in this COVID world, we know that our students are going to need a lot more and intensive support. Just any reactions or thoughts around this idea of training and supporting teachers into the field, folks who might be entering into the field by way of tutoring, right? What is the next step? What are reactions to that? Paul, I see you're first off the block.
Yeah, I love that idea. I love that comment. I saw that in the chat. I got really giddy. One of the requirements now for EPPs in North Carolina is to make sure that we have the science of reading embedded into our literacy programs. And, we've latched onto that pretty strong. We've developed a tutoring program with Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. We have a number of projects that are currently in the development stage, as well as in existence with our local districts around tutoring on literacy. And I mean, I completely agree, because what it's providing for our candidates is that kind of early foray into teaching, right? So they're getting those early, really good clinical experiences working with small groups of students, but they're also learning a curriculum that aligns with what they're going to be doing as student teachers, and then when they enter the classroom as BTs, beginning teachers. So we're really excited about that work, and I also feel like it's a way for EPPs to give back to their community and to be again that idea of being a community servant so yes, tutoring, great idea.
Yes. Meaghan, any exposure or experience that you've had with tutors and the effectiveness of that in the building, and seeing how it might help prepare someone to go into the role as a full-time teacher?
I haven't had a lot of experience with that. I know at our school we have an extended day program, which again, I'm just thinking about a lot of the work that Dan spoke to today about highly effective teachers and getting them into those roles. But also with just really thinking about, to what Paul was saying, how do we use that as a model for training teachers to better understand it? And if I'm going back to my earlier comment about that holistic approach when it comes time and being very transparent about what it looks like, how do we start to prepare them for the work that it entails? A big part of, especially, teaching our students with content, whether it's reading or math, is understanding where they are, their entry point, and what skills they need in order to reach mastery. So kind of getting teachers, getting their feet wet at the beginning to understand, what does this data process look like? How do I get or receive feedback from my administrator from a walkthrough? What do I do as far as my next steps? How can my coach support me with this? Those are good areas of practice to go ahead and start early. But then also I'm thinking about the impact it has on our kids. If our student teachers or entry teachers are able to learn these skills early on, the impact that it'll have year one for our kids.
Well, we are coming near to the end of our time, and so I do want to offer a huge thank you just to all of our panelists and all of the audience here for all questions that you have asked. We appreciate your engagement today to really help us think about headwinds and opportunities for teacher effectiveness here in North Carolina. Thank you. I'll pass it now back to Johnny.
Thank you, Alison. And let me also put a big thank you in to the participants first for your involvement. I hope you feel inspired and engaged to recruit and retain one of our most important assets. That's our best educators. And also a big thank you to the panel, Dan, Alison, Meaghan, Paul, Monique, all have done an outstanding job showing us what's possible for our students and teachers. I also want to encourage you to be in touch with myself and Johanna Anderson, our executive director, on any feedback and ideas of how the Belk Foundation can play a stronger support role in North Carolina to be a leader in teacher talent. And then I need to put a plug in for tomorrow morning. Our board's going to reconvene on a webinar focused on the art and science of reading improvement with a keynote speaker, Kareem Weaver. And many of you have already registered for this program, but we'll also put the registration information in the chat box. So again, a big thank you for being with us, and we hope that you'll join us tomorrow morning.